Bantu, and I come from St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States of America, and have a very deep interest. This is my first time being in Egypt since 10 years ago when I was here for the first time, and I first fell in love with the Coptic Church and the Coptic language and theology, and so just recently coming out of my doctoral studies in the Coptic language, and excited to be here this week talking a little bit about early Christianity in Egypt. But what's the value of studying church history? I think some of you, really kind of already. Oh, not yet. Yeah. I mean, some of you already kind of touched on it in your responses too, but maybe just a couple of quick, responses to that. Yeah. Jamie, thank you.
I think it helps put your faith into perspective. So not getting too far out and crazy, knowing that there's a whole background of people who have built on things before you.
Yeah. Anyone else?
There's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
What I thought were unique eyes in the 20th century and Middle Ages actually have been well thought of in patristic times. And that's I didn't know before I started studying it, so it's interesting.
Anyone else? Yeah, I think that's, Kim, what you brought up is a really helpful reminder for those of us, like myself, in the evangelical world, where I think sometimes we have kind of a historical, theological amnesia, and are thinking that we're dealing with asking questions for the first time that Christians have already been asking for 2,000 years. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, I think we kind of all get the idea here, and I just wanted to share a passage. This is something that church history, and again, kind of wedding that with, not just being myself, not just being a scholar, for the church in the seminary context, but specifically of church history, because as a professor of church history in a seminary context, especially in the evangelical world, I often, sometimes, maybe I'm just being biased, but I often feel like our discipline gets kind of shoved to the side, and a lot of times people aren't as interested in that. Again, in my circles, people are very interested oftentimes in learning about the Bible and learning biblical languages and exegetical skills and even theology, systematic theology, things like that. But church history often seen as like, well, that's just boring and it's just it's useless, and there's almost kind of an anti-historical vibe in a lot of the circles I run in, and especially in a lot of evangelical world. But I think some of the comments that have been made here are really helpful to remind us about how we really stand on the shoulders of many church fathers and church mothers and people that have really blazed the trail for us. And we can't really understand who we are without understanding our history and our background. And this passage in Hebrews 13:7 has been really formative for me in terms of understanding the value for church history. And it's actually very relevant for our studies in Egyptian Christianity, because this text actually figures very prominently in lots of Egyptian Coptic monastic hagiographical texts. There's lots of hagiographical literature is a very, very popular form of literature in the Coptic tradition. So that's maybe the first thing we'll learn about Egyptian Christianity. We're going to look at a lot of that, and there's a really big emphasis on telling the story of a particular saint, a particular holy person who did marvelous deeds and combated demonic forces and healed the sick and preached the word of God. And especially in late antiquity, there's a great desire in the Coptic tradition to tell these stories, and they often begin with like the first 2 pages of the writer telling the story of the monastic hero, just talking about how great this person is and how unworthy the writer is to even speak their name. But there's always this kind of, it's almost like a formula at the beginning of each hagiographical text where it's like, this person is awesome, I'm not, but I have to tell their story because the Holy Spirit's prompting me. And this is often the text that's referred to, that is quoted, which is from Hebrews 13:7, where the writer of Hebrews also, especially in Hebrews 11, 2 chapters before, just got through telling the great, heroes of the faith, and also, trying to bring to mind in the, the early Jewish Christians' mindset of the great heroes of the faith that had gone before them, and he's exhorted them to remember your leaders. And this word leader, in the Greek is actually the same word that comes up as an official title in the Egyptian monastic compounds in Upper Egypt, this hegumenos, right? This leader of the monastic community. And he's saying, remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you, consider the outcome of their way of life, and imitate their faith. There's this idea of really pondering someone's way of life, their politeia, another really common word used in kind of Greco-Coptic, this Greek loan word that gets received into Coptic in a very really specific way of, again, in the monastic context of having a way of life, a way of this related to that word for citizenship, but it's much broader, kind of how you live, and imitate their faith. There's a call to really walk this out. So that's the kind of approach that we're coming to it with, and I already see that that's what's brought a lot of us here, is trying to understand and really remember our leaders, and then also consider their godly way of life and to imitate their faith. So with that started, we're going to get into our first official, lecture segment. And I wanted to start it off with, before we get into the history of Egypt per se, wanted to start off with talking a little bit about the early church, or the earliest church, as it's presented to us in the New Testament. And as we get into understanding some of the prevalent themes in the early church in the New Testament, I want to also introduce some of these themes by way of also outlining one of our assignments for this course, which will be a final project or presentation, kind of a short response that all of you will present on our last day of class on Saturday. So I want to start off, do two things right now. Start off with explaining that presentation so you can understand a little bit what that's all about, and then also kind of lay the groundwork from the New Testament for how we're going to enter into approaching the first few centuries of Christianity in Egypt. So I want to start off with outlining a few central themes of the church in the New Testament, some things that were really prevalent, some ideas and concepts that were really in the minds of the New Testament writers, that I'm arguing that when we look at the progression of Egyptian church history in its first initial stages in late antiquity, this course is really going to focus most on Christianity in late antiquity. Today we're going to look at it in 4 different phases. Today we're focusing on the earliest stages, right? The first 3 centuries of Christianity, what sometimes people call primitive Christianity. One author that I was just reading the other day called primitive Christianity. I don't know how appropriate that is when we actually read the church fathers in the first 3 centuries. I don't know how primitive they were, but anyway. Again, that's the period that we're going to focus on today. And so to get us started, we're going to look at some broader themes of the Christian church as a whole as they develop in the New Testament. And that the first theme that we're going to look at is this theme of persecution or martyrdom, right? That persecution or martyrdom is a theme that is heavily on the minds of New Testament writers. And just as an example of that, wanted to look at the book of Revelation, chapter 13. And John says in his vision, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and a great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power which was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. So, you guys are probably familiar with this passage from Revelation 13 talking about the beast, and there's been lots of thoughts around, is this a political reference to the Roman emperor, or is this have more of a spiritual kind of sense to it? But I think one thing that is really coming through in this passage is that regardless of whether it's kind of a political association or if it's spiritual or both, which I think could be highly likely, one thing that's clear here is that in the, from the context of John, who's on exile in Patmos, that he has a clear emphasis, and there's a strong emphasis here on the persecution and the suffering that Christians are going to have to go through. That believers in this world who are living under, who will be living under the beast, will have to go through suffering and sometimes suffer martyrdom, in the form of death or just in the form of persecution. So there's a huge theme all throughout the New Testament on Christians living in this world, waiting the second coming of their Savior and having to endure the persecution. And this is something that we are going to see feature very prominently in Coptic tradition. The second one is refuting heresy. We look at 1 John chapter 2, starting at verse 18. He says, "Dear children, this is the last hour, and as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have come. This is how we know that it is the last hour. They went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. For if they had belonged to us, they would have remained with us. But their going showed that none of them belonged to us. But you have an anointing from the Holy One, and all of you know the truth. I do not write to you because you do not know the truth, but because you do know it, and because no lie comes from the truth. Who is the liar? It is whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Such a person is the Antichrist, denying the Father and the Son. No one who denies the Son has the Father. Whoever acknowledges the Son has the Father also. As for you, see that what you have heard from the beginning remains in you. If it does, you also remain in the Son and in the Father. And this is what he promised us, eternal life." So here we see in 1 John, he's talking against heretics, right? Those people who are denying the divinity, the lordship of Jesus Christ. And we see this, throughout Paul and throughout lots of New Testament literature, that there's this desire to establish among these early Christian communities a knowledge of the truth. There's a clear sense already in the beginning of Christianity that there is a true gospel and that there are these false gospels that are being, promulgated. And the gospel writers, Paul and John and Luke and others, they have this strong desire to want to reaffirm and fortify the churches of Jesus Christ with the truth. And so this idea of combating heresy or the true orthodoxy and heresy, this is something that is already present in the New Testament. That again is a very common feature in Egyptian Christianity. And then the last one I want to look at is this value of establishing proper church hierarchy. This is something that also is a very strong New Testament value. And this is something that permeates the group of letters from Paul that we call the pastorals, or the pastoral epistles, which have, by their names, as they suggest, have a lot to do with establishing proper church leadership. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul writes to Timothy, who's at Ephesus, and says, "Here's a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of full respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must first be tested, and then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons." So again, all throughout the pastoral epistles, Paul has this really strong emphasis on leadership, on proper church leadership. And this is, again, something that is one of the most unique facets of the early church in Egypt, is its strong emphasis on church hierarchy and the role of church hierarchy and the spiritual authority endowed with the patriarch. The role of the patriarch in the Alexandrian church tradition is one that is very uniquely elevated amongst almost any other early Christian community. So there's a strong emphasis on church hierarchy, and that is filtered down into the monastic communities, who also have their own very strong, acute sense of the different roles of the hegumenos, the leader of the monastery, and all the different roles they're in. So there's a strong emphasis on church hierarchy. So these are three themes that I want us to, kind of hear from the scriptures and see as they function in the scriptures, and let them be our guide as we move into this study of early Christianity in Egypt, and look at how the Egyptian church in particular has really grabbed a hold of these various themes. And what we're going to do we're going to be discussing how these themes manifest themselves throughout various examples of texts from historians, patriarchs, monks, and all the different evidence that's left for us to understand, the early church fathers in Egypt. And what we're going to do also by way of being practical, right, and really trying to understand how these voices of early Egyptian Christianity can be a benefit to us today as we are the recipients of this, as we are the modern church in Egypt, is we're going to have a presentation at the end of the class on Saturday where we really try to enter into these biblical themes as they've developed in Egyptian church history and apply them to today. So what we're going to do is each student is going to pick one of these themes. And at the end of the class on Saturday, what you're going to do is you're going to give a short, 5 to 7 minute presentation, and based on one of these themes. And the idea is what you're going to do is look at the theme and look at how it develops through the different texts and the different periods that we're going to be looking at. But again, you're going to write a research paper for this class. So that's when you really are going to get into the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts and the more academic side. So with the presentation, you can feel free to really make it a lot more practical. And what you're basically doing is you're basically responding to the class, responding to all the different themes and texts that we're going to be looking at over the next few days, picking on one particular theme. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to write about a one-page treatise or kind of document written to the Church of Egypt today. And what you're doing is basically kind of speaking into one of these three different themes and kind of what is your reflection, what is your heart for the Egyptian church today with respect to persecution, martyrdom? What would be kind of a one-page response that you would have after having reflected on where the Egyptian church has come over the years, over the centuries, with respect to the theme of martyrdom, being persecuted, all right? Because as we're going to see, this is a heavy theme in the Egyptian church. And in the 21st century, what are your words of encouragement, of exhortation for the Egyptian church with regard to martyrdom or persecution, or with refuting heresy? How has orthodoxy had to understand and defend itself against all of the various heresies that have come forth throughout the centuries of Egyptian church history, and what are some new ones today in the 21st century? What would be your thought, your encouragement to the Church of Egypt today with regard to defending the truth of Christianity against false teaching? Or with the establishing of proper church hierarchy? What's your understanding of church leadership? What do you think the Egyptian church really needs to grab a hold of again that we were talking about? What are those things that the Egyptian church of the 21st century has lost sight of, as you were mentioning? Or what are some things you want to encourage, you want to speak into? So what you're going to do is you're just going to write about a one-page document that you'll read to the class, as again, kind of reading it as if you were like one of these early patriarchs or monastic figures, kind of writing to the church as a whole. And again, it's meant to be, practical. What are some practical, things that the church can grow in? Does that make sense? Any questions or comments about that as we kind of before we transition into the next topic? Any questions or comments about that? Does it make sense? Okay.
Okay, so that one page is about one of those 3 points only.
Mm-hmm.
3 points.
Right.
Three together.
No, just you're picking one. Yeah, you're picking one, and you're kind of addressing the 21st century Church of Egypt, and with regard to one of these themes, but having reflected on, but I understand that people haven't really read a lot of the readings yet, and that's still to come. So again, this is more of just a personal response and reflection. Yeah, it becomes really important to understand the Egyptian church's emphasis that it places on its own apostolic foundation, right? For some of us in the Protestant world, this may not be as potent of a theme, but again, coming from the Catholic or Orthodox world, apostolic succession is an extremely important idea of having that authority. The authority, the spiritual and ecumenical and ecclesiastical authority derives from the apostolic succession. And so for the church in Egypt, the role of Mark and the person of the Apostle Mark from the New Testament is an extremely important starting point for us. Again, for how the Egyptian church understands its own beginnings. So in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, Peter says, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." So this particular biblical passage is extremely important for understanding the Egyptian church, the connection between the Egyptian church and Mark. And Thomas Oden has written a really helpful book on the African memory of Mark. And if you really want to get into a really more full discussion, because as you can imagine, the stories and the understanding of Mark and his apostolicity in Egypt is a very controversial topic, especially in more scholarly contexts. There's a lot of problems with it. It's not, exactly provable that Mark came to Egypt, but it's also certainly not improvable, and that it's also not clear that he didn't. This passage has been really kind of circulated a lot in the whole conversation. Some people have taken this reference to Babylon to mean the Babylon of Egypt. There's some problems with that, because it's not really likely that Peter and Mark came to Babylon of Egypt in the first century, and that the other argument for this is that Peter's reference to Babylon is actually not the Babylon of the Far East, modern day Iraq, but it's actually a veiled reference to the city of Rome. And as we just read in Revelation, right, there's lots of kind of veiled spiritual references to Rome and Roman imperial authority, and so it's much more likely that Peter and Mark would have been in Rome at this time. But again, this is just something to know about as part of like one of the important biblical passages that have to do with Mark and his early beginnings in Egypt. Another important text that we should look at is from one of the most important church fathers that we're going to get into in a little bit, which is Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria is a late 2nd century theologian who was one of the first and earliest, most prominent Orthodox Christian theologians in Egypt. One of the earliest church fathers, if not maybe the earliest. That's still accepted as a church father today. The problem, though, with this reference here from this letter is actually that it's, again, not exactly accepted universally as authentic among early Christian and New Testament scholars. So it's often called pseudo-Clement of Alexandria, because it's not exactly sure if this is actually truly written from the 2nd century by Clement, or if it's a much later, even a forged document. Some people have argued that this document, this letter from Clement, is actually a forgery that was written to support the idea that Mark was, because if this was written by Clement, then it would give us a very early piece of evidence to attest to Mark having come to Egypt to establish the church here. But he says, as for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings. He's talking about Mark's gospel right here. Not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hinting at the secret ones, but selecting those he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. But when Peter died as a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his notes and those of Peter, from which he transferred to his former book the things suitable to whatever makes for progress toward knowledge. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who are being perfected. So Clement continues, nevertheless, he yet did not divulge the things not to be uttered, nor did he write down the hierophantic teachings of the Lord, but to the stories already written he added yet others, and moreover brought in certain sayings of which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of that truth hidden by 7 veils. Thus in some he prearranged matters neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion, And dying, he left his composition to the church in Alexandria, where it even yet is most carefully guarded, being read only to those who are being imitated into the great mysteries.
Right, this sounds very like Gnostic, these secret
Mhm.
knowledge that only special people can. I don't know, maybe you'll touch on that in the topic about heresy and everything. But
Right. Well, and Clement himself, has been accused of being a Gnostic. And so that's why he's not accepted as a saint in the Catholic Church. He is in the Egyptian Church, but there's a lot of debate around. When we get into Clement and Origen, there's a large debate about to the degree to which the two of them were Gnostic. But I mean, you have people even arguing that Paul was Gnostic, and so because Paul talks about I can't even remember what passage it was, but he talks about kind of the fullness of Christ. I think that was in Ephesians, where he talks about that Greek word pleroma, the fullness of Christ. That concept pleroma is extremely operative in Gnostic cosmology and Gnostic thinking. This idea of there being this kind of layer of existence called the pleroma that's kind of between heaven and earth. And so some people argue that Paul was Gnostic because he used this term, but I would tend to think of it more being that Gnostics later picked up on some of these terms that were used by Orthodox church fathers and New Testament writers and then kind of attached new meanings to them.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
But if we look at First Clement, for example, we don't find this Gnostic idea.
Mm-hmm.
First, the universally accepted letter of Clement of Alexandria, we don't find these Gnostic ideas.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's
Right. Well, and as I mentioned, I would say with Paul, we don't find Gnostic ideas. But again, when words and concepts that are extremely operative in Gnostic teachings are used in Orthodox literature, then people will say, oh, well, they were Gnostic too, because they said gnosis, or they said pleroma, or they said, they used a word that Gnostics later used a lot. So I would agree with you that it's the same argument that it can be used of New Testament, of Paul. That, but again, the main thing here is, what's our earliest evidence again for Mark being present in Egypt? So our first two are dubious, but our earliest piece of concrete evidence comes from Eusebius of Caesarea in his ecclesiastical history. And Eusebius was bishop of Caesarea, and he wrote the ecclesiastical history, one of the first and one of the most comprehensive church histories up to that point. And this is when we get the earliest concrete piece of evidence for a contemporary early church father attesting to the story of Mark coming to Egypt. And even if you notice, even as the wording starts out, it seems clear that Eusebius isn't the first person to say this. So again, this is where we give a little bit of weight to the possibility that Mark did indeed come and establish the church in Egypt, because Eusebius even starts off by saying, now they say that this Mark was the first to have set out to Egypt to preach the gospel, which he had already written down for himself, and the first to have organized churches in Alexandria itself. So he's writing in the early 4th century, but he's starting off saying they say, and so you wish we could have more information, but unfortunately Eusebius is the earliest reliable source that attests to Mark coming to Egypt, but he's clearly relying on this story already being in existence. Yeah.
You said this is the early 4th century?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eusebius church history. Yeah. So just a little bit of summary about the idea, right? The story of Mark being in Egypt. So the idea, the really fleshed out story now doesn't come until much later, I believe in the 6th century, when the Acts of St. Mark is written. So this is a text called the Acts of St. Mark, and this is the first text that gives us the full story of Mark. It's a story that describes kind of his whole journey of coming to Egypt. There are some other sources. The Arabic history of the patriarchs of Alexandria, Eutychius of Alexandria, and Eusebius. Most of these sources date Mark's arrival being during the reign of Claudius in the 40s. But the Acts of St. Mark describe how Mark was chosen by lot among the apostles to evangelize Egypt and the surrounding areas. The idea was that he went. The story goes that he went to Cyrene, and then while he was in Cyrene, Mark received a vision that he was to go to Egypt. And when he arrived in Egypt, his sandal broke, and he went to a local cobbler, whose name was Anianus, and Mark evangelized Anianus. Anianus, believed in Christ, and he became a Christian. He was baptized, and then Mark established Anianus as the second patriarch. So again, in the Coptic Orthodox Church, there's, this goes back to that theme of ecclesiastical hierarchy, right, of church authority. That in the Coptic Church, the popes of the Coptic Church, the patriarchs, are extremely important people. The memory and remembering who these popes are is very important. And so even numbering them. So Mark is considered the first pope, and then Anianus is considered the second pope, who started off as a shoe cobbler, and then was consecrated by Mark as the second bishop of Alexandria, or patriarch. And then Mark was later killed by a pagan mob in Bukalu, and they were protesting the Paschal celebration that interfered with the festival at Serapis. And so even there again, in the Acts of St. Mark, we're also seeing that theme of heresy, right? Combating heresy or orthodoxy, encountering whether it's other versions of Christian heresy or whether it's paganism or later Islam. We always see throughout the Coptic tradition this sense of there being this orthodox trajectory that is constantly coming into contact with paganism, first, and then with Christian heresies. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the martyr stories about the Christians who suffered under the Great Persecution, the same hagiographical tropes are employed later when the bad guys aren't the pagans anymore, like the Hellenes, the Hellenistic, Greco-Roman pagans, but now they're the Christians who are heretics, right, in the Chalcedonian times. And then later, this same emphasis on suffering under heresy or combating heretical people is continued in the Islamic period, right? And so, so this is just a little bit of kind of background or introductory information about the origins of Mark. But any just questions or comments, or as we kind of wrap up that segment? Any questions or comments about, again, the earliest Christianity in Egypt? And in earliest Christianity in Egypt, as well as the broader Christian world, the concept of orthodoxy and heresy is an extremely important concept in this time period. It is going forward as well, but especially in the earliest Christianity, right? When we talk about earliest Christianity, or again, that concept of primitive Christianity, it's in those first 3 centuries, right? Before Nicaea, before the concept of orthodoxy is extremely hammered out and clear and definitive. And in Egypt, just like everywhere else, the line between orthodoxy and heresy wasn't always extremely clear, and you had presence of both, right? And you had Gnosticism, and you had what would later be understood as Orthodox Christianity. And so, a really important book, a really important resource in this conversation is Walter Bauer's book, which I'm actually kind of borrowing the title for this segment from, where his book is actually called Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, and I just added the Egyptian. But in the book Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity, Walter Bauer makes the argument, similar to what I was just saying, that in the earliest centuries of Christianity, there wasn't a very clear sense of what orthodoxy was. And there weren't these ecumenical councils that produced these authoritative creeds that people could refer to, and then which clearly delineated what was heretical and what wasn't. And also, he makes the point that Bauer wrote this book in the early 20th century, but it's been extremely influential across the board in early Christian studies of really helping us come away from this biased perspective that Orthodox Christianity just developed uninterrupted, and what we now know as Orthodox Christianity was the dominant group. And Bauer's actually pointing out that when we look at the evidence, there really wasn't a dominant group in the first few centuries, and that heterodoxy was actually the order of the day, and that what later would be understood as Orthodox Christianity was just one of many different theological expressions. Various forms of Gnosticism and other different groups, and so who were operative in Egypt. And so Egypt is definitely kind of in keeping with Bauer's thesis. So you have people who would be considered heterodox or heresiarchs. Basilides and Valentinus are philosophers who are operating in Egypt during the 2nd century, mid and late 2nd century, who would, of course, later be understood to be heretical teachers. And so Valentinus is, probably one of the most prominent Gnostic thinkers. So this was a person who was educated in Rome, and actually, some early church fathers attest that he was in line to be the Bishop of Rome and wasn't selected. And there's he's been presented throughout church history as setting up an alternative Gnostic school in Rome as kind of in response to his not being accepted as bishop. And but also he operates and he's educated for a while in Egypt as well. And but he actually enjoys most of his success in Rome. And so this kind of, for me, goes against another aspect of Bauer's thesis, which is basically that, and other people, especially people who work on Coptic church history and Syrian Orthodox as well, have come against this aspect of his thesis that he basically argues, and I'm paraphrasing here, that what would later be known as Orthodoxy developed principally in Rome, and that Alexandria and Antioch and Palestine and Syria were where most of the heterodox or heresiarchs were coming from. And so, again, I think Valentinus himself and his life is a good argument against this thesis, because Valentinus, again, while he's from Egypt, he actually, most of his teaching and leadership and influence comes when he's at Rome. And so Rome, what Bauer's trying to point us to is that, people have like Clement of Rome and others, who Rome is really kind of the Cairo of the ancient world, or the New York City. It's the main highway. It's where everyone comes. And so it would make sense to a great degree that many of the early Christian thinkers and church fathers who would later be known as Orthodox would come through and have some kind of connection with Rome. But again, I think what he's doing is, I would argue, having kind of a Roman or Western-centric view of church history, and to the neglect of early church fathers that were also influential in the earliest centuries that came out of Egypt and Syria as well, like Tatian the Syrian, or Ignatius of Antioch, or, for example, like Clement of Alexandria. And also people like Valentinus, who were operating in the center of Rome, which he's arguing is kind of the center of Orthodox Christianity. But here again, we have one of the most principal heresiarchs in early Christian history that's right in the center of Rome. And so another thing is Irenaeus, his text against heresies. Now, Irenaeus isn't an Egyptian church father, but I bring him up because there were very early in the late 2nd century, you had copies of his very famous text against heresies circulating in Egypt. In fact, some of the earliest versions of against heresies come out of Egypt. And so while people like Basilides and Valentinus were operating in Egypt, and there was various forms of Gnosticism, and that some of our earliest Coptic texts are Gnostic in nature, but most of them, again, were translations from Greek coming out of the Nag Hammadi library. You also had what would later be known as Orthodox Christianity that was very prominent in the early church in Alexandria, attested by, in fact, when you actually look at the documentary evidence, if you look at the text coming out of the 2nd century, which is, again, 2nd century is our earliest century to look at textual evidence, most of the texts that come out of Egypt in the 2nd century are Orthodox, and they're not Gnostic. The minority of texts, of religious texts coming out of Egypt are Gnostic, whereas the majority are texts like against heresies. So what I wanted to do in this next section was to actually, as we continue to have this conversation about orthodoxy and heresy as they develop in early Christianity, wanted to mix it up a little bit and do like a little kind of small group activity. And so this would be easier though if everybody had this on their laptop. But what I wanted to do is look at a few snapshots of second century Christianity. Again, we're second and third century, again, earliest Christianity. And I wanted to look at, do like a compare and contrast of these, kind of different expressions of Christianity. And so I picked three different examples, one being Orthodox, Clement of Alexandria, who, definitely need to talk about. And then also one being an example of Gnosticism from a text called the Gospel of Truth. And then the other one being an excerpt from the life of Mani to look a little bit at Manichaeism, which is also another very important early heresy that from the 3rd century on for several centuries after was extremely popular in Egypt as well. Yeah.
I think if we were able to connect to the Wi-Fi here, if you could maybe write the password up there, then we can probably on our phones have the document you're saying. It would be easier if we could look at it.
Yeah.
Together in our groups. That might be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we gotta try to do that. I'm gonna try to do that tomorrow. Make sure put up any slides so you guys can follow along with. This is easier back home because we have like an online portal and all the students have it all on the website. But I think what we'll do actually is maybe if I could get some volunteers who want to maybe read out for us, these different excerpts, and then maybe I'll just try to like kind of float between the three on the board, and you can keep looking and then just kind of show, talk about the differences and similarities, especially with regard to how these different authors are approaching truth and how a person goes about attaining truth, how a person perceives of truth, and again, this focus on knowledge and how these authors are exhorting their congregants and their communities to approach attaining truth and wisdom and knowledge in life. Does that make sense? That's kind of the specific focus. So can somebody, so we're just going to compare and contrast these different 2nd and early 3rd century texts. So we'll start off with an excerpt, which is in your reader actually, from Clement of Alexandria. Can somebody read this for us? And then again, we'll read it nice and slow and digest it, and then I'll just, when you start discussing in groups, then I'll just kind of put them all three up back on the board, kind of for a few minutes each, so you can go back and look at them some more. But yeah, Kim, can you read it? Thank you, Kim. So can I get another volunteer to read this excerpt from this text called the Gospel of Truth? So this has kind of been identified as Gnostic. Heidi? Oh, all right, thanks. So if you could, maybe with like 2 or 3 people, just for a couple minutes, kind of let's split up and just, I'll go back through these and keep putting them up on the board so you can refer back to them. But again, what are the differences about how these Orthodox Christian and Gnostic and Manichaean leaders and writers are approaching how their congregants are to approach truth and knowledge and wisdom, and what are they how are they exhorting them to live as believers. Come back together and share what some of our thoughts were. So what did you guys find to be some of the differences or similarities here? And I mean, obviously these are just very small little snippets of kind of whole worldviews and theological systems, but just based on kind of these little previews into what are you seeing as some of the differences or similarities? Yeah.
I think I noticed that the first difference is the quest of each one. The gospel of truth, it's a blind force that anoint someone and may last and may be dissolved. But the man has no power to choose it. Clement make it more active. He's moving towards God. And the third one, like for many, he is the main quest. All the knowledge are collected, gathered in. That's what I noticed.
Yeah. I mean, obviously the big difference that is hinted at here, at least when it comes to Mani, that is really important in terms of Manichaean theology and cosmology, is that Mani himself was divine, and that he saw himself as the next coming of Christ. And so even when he talks about my scriptures, right, that but then when Manichaeism, one of the interesting things that this quote brings out about Manichaeism is the way in which it contextualizes and incorporates local traditions into the Manichaean cosmology. So, even as he says here that in one sense, he says Jesus was to the West and Buddha was to India and I was sent to Persia. But ironically, Manichaeism had much greater success outside of Persia than it did in Persia. And he eventually was killed in Persia because it was a Zoroastrian state. And Mani was later imprisoned by the Shah of Persia, and then he died in prison. But Manichaeism, this is not just like a kind of small heretical sect within Christianity, but this is a major world religion.
For a while?
What's that?
Was Augustine for a while?
Yeah, Augustine was, he was a Manichaean for a time.
For 9 years, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I don't remember exactly how many years, but Augustine and his kind of reflections on the Manichaean religion and practice are actually one of the principal sources about how we can learn more about Manichaeism. And he talks about kind of the food ritual, right, the eating ritual. And this is a huge part of Manichaean. There's a book by a scholar named Jason Badun, and it's called The Manichaean Body. And Badun in the book argues that the food ritual in Manichaeism is actually the center point for really understanding the cosmology and theology around Manichaeism, that you have this group of people called the elect, and the elect are the kind of the priests or the holy people in the religion, and then you have the hearers or the congregants who offer food, and the elect eat it. And through this eating ritual, the idea, because in Manichaean cosmology, the world is, it's similar to Gnosticism in the sense that it has this dualistic sense of the spiritual and the physical, but again, it's different, and most Manichaean scholars, I think, would caution us to really understand Manichaeism as being very distinct from like Valentinianism, a Valentinian type of Gnosticism, or Bar Dyson, who Bar Dyson was another Gnostic, because again, who you call Gnostic and what you mean by that it just depends on who you're talking about. So even the term Gnostic, a lot of people are calling into question how helpful it really is, because when you look at Valentinus and his system, it's very different than Bar-Dyson, or it's very different than Mani. And again, a lot of these people argue with each other, like Marcion and Valentinus and Bar-Dyson, would dispute with one another. So it's not like they were all sitting. So again, this goes back to Bauer's point about the variety of different Christianities in the early centuries, and how it's not like there's Orthodox over here and all the heretics over here, but there was a very big kind of plethora of Christian movements in this early period, and they're not all characterized by this anti-physical, pro-spiritual worldview. I mean, in a sense they are, but Manichaeism approaches it in a different way, whereas in a more Valentinian system, there's this denigration of the flesh and the physical, corporeal world. Whereas in the Manichaean system, again, if we even think about this eating ritual, it's actually through the process of, nothing could be more physical than eating, right? And it's this physical process of eating, and they even had this idea that it's kind of, for me, it was kind of funny when I was reading through it. When you read through the Kephaliah of the Teacher, which is a Coptic text that comes out of Kelea. And Kelea, again, is a huge source, one of the hugest sources of Gnosticism, Manichaeism in general. Kelea had a very thriving Manichaean community, I think, up until the 7th century. And a lot of texts that survive in Coptic are some of our only source for understanding Manichaeism. And I remember translating and reading through the Kephaliah of the Teacher, and it kind of was describing the eating ritual, and the idea again was that light and dark are trapped together in the physical world, and that the way that we go to heaven is by trying to separate out the light from the dark particles. And so there's light particles and dark particles, and the elect would eat the food, and especially certain foods that were thought to have more light particles, and they would defecate the dark particles out, and they would burp the light particles, and they would go back into the air, and again the pleroma. And so again, and then even when we talk about Bar-Dyson, which isn't really relevant to our purposes, but that's more in the Syriac-speaking world in Edessa. But for Bar-Dyson, he talks about the stars and the role of astrology, and how the stars and the moon and the planets in the sky are God's way of speaking to us. And he was very, very informed by kind of that Mesopotamian astrology. And then, so again, the physical world is very important in this world of thinking, in a very different way. And then even his famous text, the Book of the Law of the Countries, talks about how God has revealed his providence in the manifestation of various nations, and he talks about the practices of different nations and how the differences within human culture attest to God's presence. And so, again, there's just so many different versions of this, and to call it all Gnosticism isn't always very helpful. But anyway, any other thoughts or kind of similarities or differences?
Well, we just thought it was interesting that in this piece of text right here, it doesn't have anything about what you should do per se. There's no ethical, this is right, this is wrong. Just that these are the people that hold the knowledge, so whatever they say, that's kind of like the word of God. And also seeing it as sort of setting up for, since it's showing Revelation as a kind of progressive thing, setting up for future prophets, such as Muhammad, or such as even in the United States, someone like Joseph Smith, to say, I'm the next prophet, I'm the one that God has called to reveal these new truths to you. Listen to what I have to say. So.
Yeah, even this analogy of a river, right? That he's Mani is the river, and all these different other, streams of thought flow into his one river. And so Manichaeism was unique in the way it would, and again, if we put ourselves back in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, Manichaeism would be a world religion on par with Christianity or Islam. Again, this isn't some kind of small sect off to the side, but this was a major world religion that had people in China and all throughout Central Asia, India, Persian Empire, Roman Empire, Egypt, here in Egypt as well, and then going into the Latin West with people like Augustine. And wherever it went, it would be very intentional about incorporating indigenous religious thought and culture. And so in China, Mani was thought of as a new Lao Tzu, and founder of Taoism. And then later in Islamic periods, Muhammad was, Mani was likened to Muhammad, and Islamic, thought was kind of grafted into Manichaeism, and then in the Roman Empire, it was, he was thought of as another Jesus, and so it would just kind of take and adapt, anybody. And so I even think that, and it's, it seems like, because again, Manichaeism was persecuted almost everywhere it went. It was a minority religion. The only example counter to that is the only example of Manichaeism being the state religion of an empire was actually during the Uyghur Khaganate. And so I think about the 12th or 13th century, Uyghurs today are an ethnic minority in northwestern China. But in about the 12th or 13th century, during the Mongolian Empire, Uyghurs had a much larger empire in, kind of Mongolian and northwestern China, and for about 100, 150 years. And during that time, they actually embraced Manichaeism as the state religion, because Manichaeism was also growing, especially in the Mongolian Empire, because during the Mongolian Empire, the Mongolians were much more embracing of different religions, more so than Islamic or the Chinese Empire was. And so Christianity, in the form of the Church of the East, which is the East Syrian, you might have heard of Nestorians. That's not really like the right name to give them, but the Church of the East was flourishing alongside Manichaean religion in this time period. But yeah, so. Any other thoughts or comments? So you kind of get, the purpose of this was to get a feel for the different varieties of Christianity that were operating in Egypt in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And you had all of these different thoughts. And it really isn't until the late 2nd century and early 3rd century that we start to get, it's really not till the 4th century that again, across the board, and this is what Bauer's arguing, that orthodoxy becomes a very clear concept. But in the late 2nd and early 3rd century in Egypt, orthodoxy starts to take more of a form.